Welcome, everybody. We're gonna open up the class, and it's going to take us about 5 minutes for everyone to assemble. Thanks for your patience. Denise, shall we kick off?
Sure thing. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Denise Menard, and thank you all for being here today for our program, Irrigation Basics. Now, on behalf of the UC Master Gardeners of Santa Cruz and Monterey counties, we really like to welcome you to a really great program we've got today. Before we get to the class, though, a couple of the usual requests and kind of reminders about Zoom presentations. So we ask you to please keep your microphone muted and your video off during the program to keep distractions at a minimum. We recommend that you use the speaker view for your best results. If you have any technical questions, I'll be happy to help you with them. You can message me in the chat and we'll get you up and running. If you'd like to see as well as hear the conversation, at the bottom of your screen is a button for live transcript. You can click on it for real-time closed captioning. Please submit any questions you have in the chat and we'll answer them during the Q&A session after the presentation. Just a reminder, our event is being recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording within a couple of days after class. And that's all I've got. So I'm going to turn the program over to our moderator, Delise.
Thank you all for coming. We are your sponsors tonight, brought to you by the UC Cooperative Extension Master Gardener Program of Monterey and Santa Cruz County. And if you don't know what we do, we are a research-based information consulting service. We basically provide classes and have a hotline and support home gardeners. And basically, it's the same organization that Cooperative Extension is. They help advise farmers, and these Cooperative Extension farmers, advisors, train throughout the state, train us, the volunteers, to work with home gardeners. And when we need to, we can escalate questions to them. Thank you all for attending, and thank you especially to those who were able to donate. It's been a tough year. We really understand We appreciate your generous support. This is an all-volunteer program, and we look forward to hearing from you later. You're on our mailing list now by virtue of having signed up for this class. And if you don't want to be on that mailing list, you can just unsubscribe in the next email that you receive. Or you can go to mbmg.ucanr.edu to get more information about classes coming up, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Avry Miller, who is going to tell us a little bit about her history.
Awesome. Hi, so I'm Avry, and just a little bit about me. So I grew up kind of really rural in the East Coast, and I was very disconnected from my food when I was younger. Ate a lot of packaged food, but I loved nature. I've always loved nature and that fresh seasonality of like, we're coming into summer right now and I'm getting really excited because we have strawberries and corn on the cob and these things that I really loved, and started growing this passion. And after college, I was working in restaurants and just became more and more interested about where that food was coming from. Started volunteering at the farmers market and just understanding a little more about what is fresh food and healthy eating, and kind of a lot different than the way I grew up. And let's see if I can, which eventually brought me to Arizona to start farming. I just really wanted to understand. I had that curiosity, and it changed my life. And throughout, after doing a season in Arizona, I've continued to farm, and eventually came down about 4 years ago now to Santa Cruz to do the farm program at the UCSC for the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. I was there as a first year and a second year, and then came for a third year, and really started to not just dig into like how to grow food and be involved with my food, but I started specializing in irrigation. And as a second and a kind of a being there for a third year, got to teach irrigation to other people that were first year apprentices. And this relationship with water just has like built and built and built, and exploring that. And so this is kind of where I come from and where a lot of my knowledge comes from, and that exploration. Now I'm out in the Santa Cruz Mountains, starting a little perennial permaculture nursery and homesteading on 2.5 acres. So that's kind of my journey here today. I'd be curious if you want to hop in the chat and just write a little bit about what brought you here. What is your interest in understanding a little bit more about irrigation? This is basic, but what brought you here? Things that we're gonna kind of address today, because this is a basics class, we're gonna touch on a couple little things. So general, what is irrigation and plants? Water-wise irrigation, how to evaluate soil moisture by feel, understanding variables in plant water needs. We're going to talk a little bit about drip systems specifically, and then we're going to talk about designing drip systems. This is going to be more of a drip focused workshop, because that's a pretty standard method that we use kind of in this, this region here. So what is the role of water? As in the initial thing, it's like water and the life cycle are one, right? Everything needs water to survive. And irrigation is essentially this process that we as humans have started to get water that maybe isn't naturally occurring to the plants to cultivate and to continue that life cycle of life and growing food. And it's been around for so long. It's the fundamentals of so much civilization. And plants need this water because it's the building blocks to create their physical structure, to do nutrient exchange, to maintain temperature. Kind of just thinking about in our bodies, all the things we need water for. Plants are very similar. We really reflect that with one another. So when we're thinking about, especially in our California climate, how we are in a place where we have a wetter season and a drier season, and then the shift in the amounts of available water, we want to be really wise with water when we're using it, especially to grow crops and to be more sustainable. So I came up with this idea of like how to be a water wise irrigator. And there's these different things to think on. So water conservation is just using the right optimal amount of water so that we're getting the healthiest plants without, and the healthiest, strongest plants, and just creating that like good sustainable systems. And so we lose water in our system with the plants in two main ways. We lose it through transpiration, which is water that's lost through the plant leaves, and evaporation, which is water that's lost through the soil surface. When we put these two together, we often use this word evapotranspiration, where we're losing both of those. So a couple ways to reduce that is going to be like mulching. We're going to cover that soil surface to help with some of that water loss. Watering at the right times of day, kind of, you can imagine if we're watering in the mornings when it's cooler, the sun's going to be less intense, or in the evening. And then having good soil structure, which is the thing that we're always coming back to as like farmers and gardeners, right? Having our optimal soil in there. And so irrigation is when we add water. So this is how we're losing our water. And why? What are some ways, some other ways that we're going to do that is this concept of the wet dry swing. I really grew up thinking like, oh, you just add water just all the time, but plants really want this wet dry swing. It's going to encourage them to grow nice deep roots. So we want to really find that perfect balance where the plant is getting what it wants without these issues of over and under watering. And how we're going to do that is we're going to explore these concepts of field capacity and soil moisture throughout this next little bit. But quickly, I just want to address like what are some of the issues with overwatering. Say you're going out there every day and just watering and watering and watering. First, we're thinking about like our climate, what we have access to. So we're living in a time where there's less water available. So we just want to be more sustainable. But also for the plants, that can cause a lot of the nutrients to leach through that soil surface and no longer be accessible to the plants. It can cause rotting in the roots if they're constantly wet and unable to really absorb. And we could also be germinating a lot of additional weed seeds or things that we're not trying to cultivate by like oversaturating a zone. Underwatering is going to lead to issues of poor structural growth for our plants, having really weak plants that aren't going to be nutritionally dense and wonderful for us, and also just plant failure. So to work with all of these things, we want to find that balance with our wet dry swing. And our main method for this is what we call soil moisture by feel. This is a method that's great on small scale gardening because it's a physical tactile method. And it addresses different things like how large are our crops, our stage of development, environmental factors, the weather, our visual engagement with the plants. And as gardeners, especially, having more of that relationship with our soil is going to be really just like nourishing. And so to talk about like how we're exploring this a little bit, I made a little video of some of the vocabulary. So let's give you some of the vocabulary for how we're going to talk about assessing our soil moisture by feel. utilize our sponge here to represent the soil to get these terminology down. The sponge is a great example because it has air pockets and structure. It's raining or we're irrigating. All of the pore spaces in the soil are completely full. This is saturation. As that rain stops, there is a trickle of water coming through the soil profile. This is our gravitational water. This is water being pulled down via gravity. Once that's finished, we're left with 100% field capacity. So saturation minus gravitational water, field capacity. As time happens, transpiration, evaporation, or transevaporation, we're going to be losing water in our system. And all of this water that's coming out easily is going to be our plant available water. You can imagine my hand is kind of like the root system, soaking and then losing the water through its leaves and through the soil surface. What we're left with is a soil profile that does have water in it, but it's being held onto by the soil or the sponge. This is unavailable water. And at this point, we get to a field capacity that is decreased to a point we call a permanent wilting point, where the water is unavailable to the plant, thus it will wilt and eventually die. So hopefully that was a little helpful to have some visualization of some of these words that we're going to be using throughout the next little bit. So our soil saturation, all of our pore space is full with water. It's actively raining. Our gravitational water, just imagine gravity is pulling that down. It's percolating like that coffee, going down. Our field capacity is the soil once that gravitational water is gone. And then we have our permanent wilting point where the plants can no longer get that water and they die. And then the plant available water, that space in between those two. So all soil types, there's no one size fits all. All soils have a different type. And to truly understand how water is going to move in your soil, first you have to understand your soil type texture. This is a pretty simple thing that you can do with a simple jar test. Just grab some of your soil, stick it in a jar, and shake it for a good few minutes, and then let it sit. There's three main elements of our soil type texture. We're going to have our clay, which are going to be the smallest particles, the silt, which are kind of the mid-sized particles, and then sand. And we've seen examples of these in nature. The beach is very sandy. The water comes up, it percolates pretty fast down. Clay, if you've ever done pottery, the water is going to slick off of that a lot more. So an ideal soil texture is going to have a combination of all of these, and they're all going to function a little differently. So here's a few examples of some jar tests that I did previously. And then just quickly, I wanted, in case you want to do this yourself, there's kind of this method of measuring out where you are seeing your amounts. So you'll see the heaviest thing, the sand is going to fall to the bottom, and the silt is going to kind of stay to the center, and the clay is going to stay at the top. A lot of these particles just floating at top are going to be things like different organic materials, carbonation stuff, leaves, and that can mostly be ignored for this. So just measuring that out, figuring out kind of these simple percentages, and then following this little chart here is going to give you a better idea of what your soil type texture is. So in my first jar, I had about 75% sand, about 18% silt, and 7% clay. So I come over on the bottom here, I usually do my biggest number first. finding my 75% sand, going up to about my 18% clay, and then it should, if your math is right, it should automatically kind of hit you there. So on my property, I'm kind of dealing with a loamy sand, like a sandy loam in that zone. At the school garden that I help out at, we have more of a 50% sand, a 40% silt, and a 10% clay. So we're getting a little more in that medium loam. So you can see all of these different options that your soil might have. And what that's going to inform you, like I said, is how water is going to move through your system. So with my system that is more sandy, I'm going to see more of the water going down gravitationally through the soil profile versus spreading. And this is because of capillary action. In clay, we're having water that moves a little more outward, whereas more sandy soils, it's going to go down faster. And as you can see, the amount of gravitational water is going to really shift between a sandy soil where we have a large amount of gravitational water and a clay soil where there is virtually none, because those small clay particles have a larger surface area and they're actually going to be able to hold on to more water because they're so little, versus this big sand particle is going to only be able to hold on to so much water before it comes off. Similarly, because of that same way that it's holding on to water versus gravitational water, it's going to hold on to water that the plants can or cannot get to. So a clay might be holding on to that water and not letting it fluff off with gravitation, but it also is not going to be available to be penetrated by the plant's roots. So that unavailable water is also going to be shifting in these different things, versus the sand, the bigger particle, may be losing more water, but is going to have more that the roots can hold on to. So we're aiming to be in this happy zone where we have maximum available water to find that balance with our plants. And we're doing this with our soil moisture by feel. So once we understand our texture and we are having a good idea of what that's feeling like, we can start actually checking our soil to see when is a good time to water, because we want to do this wet dry swing, and we want to water at a point when the plant is thirsty but not too dry or not too wet. We're gonna start checking our soil moistures. It's easiest to learn how to check your soil moisture with that 100% field capacity, because we don't have a little digital thing telling us. We need that high percentage to get that feel. And this is just a little chart that you can come back to once you know your soil texture to know how much you could put down with your drip irrigation system to know that you're at that 100% field capacity, or if it was wintertime after a nice rainstorm, etc. So how are we doing the soil moisture by feel? There's kind of 4 main elements that we're always looking at. We're going to come back to these. You're going to hear me say these like a bunch. We're analyzing the color of our soil. Wetter soil is darker, drier soil is lighter in color. We're going to analyze the moisture on our hands, so really feeling that. And does it analyze kind of these visual assessments? Is it sticking together or is it ribboning? And I'll talk a little bit more about ribboning in a second. And because we can't be in the garden together, which I think would be really lovely, I made a little video to kind of explore some of these together. So our first zone where we're going to do some soil moisture checking by feel, it really helps to have a lovely companion, like little olives here. Also, this is a soil probe. This is a pretty small soil probe. I like to stick my soil probe right between the plants, where I imagine if my irrigation was running, where the water would actually be going with the plants. I can just pop that up. It's this consistent color all the way through. And that's going to tell me that I have moisture going all the way through. You'll see over the next couple of days as we do this, the color is going to lighten as the top dries down. So we can grab this and seeing that dark, rich color, feeling this moisture sticking in my hands. Because this is kind of a sandy soil, it doesn't work so well to do the clump test, but it is holding fairly well for such a sandy soil. This is a different zone of my garden space. This was unimproved soil. This is our native soil here. And it's got a lot more sand in it. So I thought it would be fun to see what the sand looks like right after it rains. I'm going to use my hori-hori this time just to give you another feel. So I really do want to try to get down there a good 6 inches, but I'm going to pull this up, and similarly we've got that nice dark color. That's our first thing we're looking for. Checking our ball, our casting ball, and it's actually holding together super well. And then the residue on my hand, I've definitely got some residue. So you can see how you could just go check soil moisture over and over and over. And that is actually the best way to learn it. When I was teaching at UCSC, I had my apprentices check the same things every day and really watching and exploring that. So it's a very much a like interactive thing. So we have the chart that is going to get sent to you, where once you have your soil type, and just connecting with these ideas of like, I know that because it rained the day before I made this video, and I have a loamy sand that I had a dark color soil. It did form a weak ball. It did not ribbon. I'll talk about that. And it left some moisture on my hand. So I just had this idea that we're at this high field capacity. And then watching it over the next couple days, this is the second site, the sandier site. I began to see with my soil probe that the top part was becoming lighter in color. When I was trying to form a ball, it wasn't balling up as much. So seeing this decrease in that moisture as we went through time. And it's pretty typical with things that the field capacity is going to decrease from the top down. Often the bottom is going to have a moister zone than the top, and that's just simple. So following that, constantly coming back to our chart. In the school garden site where we had more of a medium loam, you can kind of see that it formed a slightly better ball. I don't have the video for this one, but we can come to this concept of ribboning. And ribboning only mostly works with our more clay dominant soils, so our medium and our heavy soils. And essentially you take some soil in your hand and try to like push it through your fingers. And that clay is gonna, depending on how much moisture it has, is gonna form kind of a ribbon. And that will be another estimate for how much moisture is in that soil. On the other end, it's also, if you get it wet, a great way to do another texture test to see how far you can get that when it is super wet, and if you have more clay or more sand. So with all of this, I know I probably went through it really fast, but I think it all comes down to get to know your soil type, get your hands in your soil, and kind of work off of this chart and just keep testing it, keep understanding that, and exploring with your soil and how moist it is. Once you kind of have an idea of like what are these field capacities, then you can start understanding when you want to water. So the idea is with most plants, we're trying to water, we're trying to do our wet dry swing in our field capacity around the like 45 to 60%. And the reason it's there is because like remembering that soil particle is holding on to some of that water, and so it's not available to the roots. So that's, say, like that 45 to 60%. So that's when we want to water, when we're getting right to that point where our plants are going to just be about thirsty. And always going back up to 100. So our wet dry swing is going to be going from that watered to dry, and like kind of swinging back and forth between that. The basic rule of thumb when we're doing this is also thinking about the depth. So our younger plants are going to need less quantity of water, but more frequently. And this kind of goes with, they are going to have smaller root systems, and that's going to dry down more often than, say, a larger plant, which is going to have a deeper, stronger root system, and that's going to dry down less often. There also are some critical phases for our plants when they might need or want more water. And a lot of this is going to deal with getting to understand and know your specific crops. Many plants on the annual are going to have this like young, kind of less water more frequently, kind of going up, and then after their fruiting phase are going to come to a stage where they need that dry down, they need less water. You can think of this especially with things like storage onions or our winter squashes, our garlics, things that just are going to start drying down, and if we're overwatering them at this phase, they're going to get too wet, they're going to rot. So annuals kind of have this little bit of a bell curve with their watering. And when we understand that and are watering appropriately different throughout their lives, we're also being water wise and conserving water by not over watering too early in their life or at different phases of their life. So a few irrigation needs of specific crops. Annuals. So we are mostly talking about doing things on dripline. So when planting your plants, really planting right on that drip line is going to be the best. You want your plants close to where the water is coming out. I will say often after, if I'm direct seeding a crop, like putting the seed right in the ground underneath a drip line, I do often put a hose on it for the first couple days, and just to give it a nice saturation, but switching it over after that. Critical life stages for annuals are usually going to be their vegetative growth, their flowering, and their fruit set. These are times when you want to really make sure that they're not getting stressed by being underwatered or overwatered. And then knowing if you have a drought tolerant crop. Here in this region, we have a lot of dry farm tomatoes, or there's hot peppers are also going to be on the lower end of wanting those field capacities, different dry beans, different corns, different native flowers. So understanding your crops and what their specific needs are. And then water loving crops. Broccolis tend to be a good example of this. When they're going and getting into that phase where they're creating their head, they get really, really hungry and they want a lot of water. And so we actually often will water them a little extra so that they can really plump up because they're trying to go to flower. In this concept of water loving crops, I often like to think to myself, is this a crop that is appropriate and I need to grow it now or in this space? And trying to find that balance of, do I have the water for that? Does it in the end feel like what I'm really looking for? So always checking and addressing if that's the right crop for you. With perennials, we're often going to treat them mostly like mature annuals. So they're going to have much deeper root zones than our annuals, and they're going to need greater wet dry swings. They often can handle a lot more. Orchard trees are a really great example of this. As once established, most orchard trees have feeder roots that are 18 to 36 inches deep. And I had a short soil probe in that video because I was checking annual beds, but when checking the moisture under a fruit tree, you're going to want to really get down and check that moisture where the tree or whatever else you're growing is actually drinking the water from. And keep with that wet dry swing. Get there. This also is going to have to do with the amount of water you put out. So often with an orchard tree, if I put some drip circles around it, I might end up running those for 2 to 3 hours to get enough water down into that soil profile. But I might only run it every week or every 2 weeks, depending on the season and the needs of that time. Cane fruits, like our raspberries and blackberries, can often be controlled with water. They have really nifty little methods where they move out. Understanding your natives. And then I grow a lot of medicinal herbs here on our property, and really looking at the needs of the herb. Before I plant it, I do some research. I figure out, okay, are they water loving, and how can I put them in the most appropriate place for them, and find that balance, because a lot of perennials are going to be able to either handle more water stress or be a little less acceptable of water stress. So really researching and understanding your plants before putting them in the ground is a lovely thing to do. So we're going to switch gears a little bit to drip system design and how to talk about that. We're going to mostly be following this example from the school garden that we were looking at the soil of earlier. But there's some questions to ask yourself when designing a drip system. And the biggest one is, what is my goal? Why do I want to add drip irrigation? What do I have available? And how large an area needs irrigation? And how much automation do I want? I think these are all things to know beforehand, because one system isn't going to work for everybody. And maybe some systems, like maybe some people don't need systems at all. So really checking in with yourself, because irrigation is a water saving method, but also a cost investment. So our example is an elementary school garden that had previously been always hand watered, and then we installed an irrigation system. So what did we already have? We had 14 4x10 boxes with a mix of annuals and perennial flowers. The water came from a hose bib at the top of each bed. And why did we want to have a drip irrigation system? With being a school garden, it's a little inconsistently watered. Sometimes children might leave the faucets on, so we wanted to reduce risk and create a more uniform system, as well as reduce the stress for the gardener to do summer watering with parent volunteers. So we're going back to those questions. Where's the water coming from? This is always the most important question. And in the school garden, each bed has its own hose bib, and it was already pre-set up to some underground plumbing. But maybe in your system, you have gray water or a rainwater system. You might have city water or well water. These are all things to just like know a little bit about where your water is coming from. And what is the quality of the water? So is it, like I said, if it's city water, what chemicals are in it? I'm out here on a well, so I have a lot of sedimentation in my water, and that's going to affect how my drip system really functions and works. And so with the school garden, because it's in the middle of Santa Cruz, we have city water and very little sedimentation. When designing a system, we always want to start with a header, and the header is where's the water coming from. It's going to attach to that water source. All headers are going to begin with an on-off valve, and most of the water sources are on-off valves, like the little wing nut here, that's an on-off valve, but a timer can also function as an on-off valve. Timers can be, well, I'll show a few examples, but they can be kind of these in-ground ones that really get put right on that shut off and can be set. Or there'll be some other ones, but there's also an on-off valve. This is kind of a double on-off valve, like an emergency, that can get turned off before the timer. So in the school garden, we put in this timer to shut off all water during non-school times, just in case something got left on by a student or a parent volunteer. The second thing we want after our on-off valve is filtration. And there's a few forms of filtration, but this is a pretty common inline screen filter. Even if you're on city water, you want to have a filter because it's going to help your drip system just run better. These screen filters are awesome. They're really easy to just unscrew and clean with a toothbrush. Like I mentioned, I have really high sedimentation in my garden space here. So I have these more high capacity filters. This is also a screen filter and another called a disc filter. And they're all essentially doing the same thing, just at different levels. With creating systems where the water has to push through small pore spaces or these discs to get out all that debris before it goes into our drip lines and to reduce the clogging. The last thing we want for our header is a pressure regulator. And a pressure regulator is basically going to make sure that we don't have too much water going too fast through our tubing. And it's just going to work on the lifespan of that and create uniformity, because we do want, when we run our system, the plants at the beginning of the bed to get the same amount of water as the plants at the end of the bed, and a pressure regulator is going to help maintain that. So here's an example of a simple header that might just be like anywhere. We've got our on-off valve, our inline screen filter. This is just a timer, and then a pressure regulator. And all of these things are going to have arrows with directional flows. So if you ever are installing something, turning it on, and then noticing it's not working, check the arrows, check the flow. The other thing is that when we install a system and turn it on, we really want to check for leaks. And so creating tight fittings and having, there's these little sometimes connector parts that we need. And this is where going to an actual irrigation store is going to be really helpful, because they will often give you all the little parts and just give you all the little tips to make sure that you're getting from point A to B without having a lot of leaks. Because this is probably one of the biggest water-wise irrigator things, is to create a system that's not wasting water through leaking randomly. And that can be hard, because often things will just start springing a leak here and there, and it's a lot of fixing it, but also it's an exploration in your garden. So we have our header, designed that based on the function of where water is coming from and where we're going to. So how do we talk about parts that we want to get the water from there? Parts are usually talked about in a couple terms. First is the diameter. Commonly around here, most are going to be in inches. You can get stuff in other forms, but I find using inches is pretty standard. So we have 1 inch, 3/4, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, and this is just some examples of some tubing. This is all what we call poly tubing. It's plastic, and it has no emitters. So it's taking water from our header setup that we created and bringing it to the plants. The next thing we're talking about is often the shape. So we'll have things that are like a compression fitting, which uses force to hold things together. Threaded fittings, which kind of uses that threaded element. So that's one way. The biggest difference with compression and threaded fittings, partly it's depending on where you go, they just might only have one or the other available. But when you're designing a system, threaded fittings are easier to remove and adjust over and over. Compression fittings tend to be a little more permanent, but compression fittings are much cheaper generally. So we want to think about with our systems, what are things that we can invest in for a long time and really put that investment back in. So if we're designing a system that maybe is only going to be installed for a year, and then we're going to move and go somewhere else and maybe take that system apart and want to reuse those parts, maybe getting threaded fittings might be better. But if we're installing something for the next 10 years, because I really believe that when we use anything plastic, it should have a long lifespan, going with those compression fittings can be just fine and a little more economical. Couplers, so back to shapes. Couplers attached to in a line. So we have a few couplers here. Elbows kind of make that elbow. T's will make that T attaching 3 things. And then goof plug is kind of an end, or their end caps. So all these different ways that things are just moving to create. It's a lot of shape design, which is fun. And these are kind of little 1/4 inch examples here. These are all 1/2 inch examples up top. Oh, there's some text. And then we get into 3/4 inch. And once we start getting into these larger sizes, we kind of also come into parts that will shift from, say, 3/4 into 1/2 inch, like I have here, a 3/4 inch to 1/2 inch T. That then goes into a zone, and then I have an on-off coupling there so that if I am running this section and maybe I don't want to water those specific plants, I can turn that off and save water that way. And this is all going to be addressed on your specific needs for your garden. Then we're getting into the actual drip line tubing, which is also going to have these different size spaces. Two most common are going to be our 1/4 inch and our 1/2 inch. And with that, they'll have different spacings in between them about how far apart the emitters are. 1/4 inch often comes in 6, 12, 18 inches. Most 1/2 inch drip line is going to start at 12-inch spacing. And then if you're in a system where your plants are much farther apart, maybe you don't need constant water through that whole region. Maybe there's one plant here and another plant a couple feet away. Though you can also add your own individual emitters that will also drip specifically where you want it, and those can pop right into that mainline tubing. So there's a lot of parts, but it's really quite straightforward in the end once you get to know it. The other thing we're looking at when buying parts is the flow rate. And this is going to be variable based on all of these different things that are based on these. So the flow rate is usually in gallons per hour. You might find it in liters per hour, but I would shift it to gallons per hour because you're going to get a handout and that will be all in gallons per hour. And understanding if you have options for different flow rates, it's coming back to that soil texture type. In our sandier soils, we can handle a larger flow rate because we are having more gravitational water go down. Versus the clay soil, if to have a really high flow rate, like more water coming out at once, that could create too much pooling in that soil because it's not going down. So when there's options, understanding what your soil texture type is going to help you decide what is the best flow rate. And you can see in this like half-inch tubing, there's options of like 0.6 to 0.9 gallons per hour. So on my property where we have quite sandy soils, I might want to go for that 0.9 gallons per hour to really get that water in and saturating and kind of spreading a little better. The other things we're looking at when buying drip line is our pressure range, which is where that pressure regulator is going to come in. Most water that's coming out of a hose is into a house is about 60 psi, and most of these drip lines aren't gonna operate at that high of a pressure range. So you'll see we've got 20 to 60 for the 1/2 inch, but we've got only 30 psi for our little 1/4 inch. We're also looking at how long of a line can we run. Often these little 1/4 inches, we only want to run a 15-foot section versus the 1/2 inch can run up to 300 feet. And then the spacing, that's also going to be slightly affected by the soil type. So if you have a clay soil, you can kind of handle a larger spacing between your drip emitters because that's going to percolate. It's going to have that capillary action outwardly, as we talked about. But if you have a sandy thing, you want your drip emitters potentially closer to each other so that you can saturate that soil before it gets down. And as a side note, most of the time we are going to assume that our drip lines are running at about, probably if they're new, 90% efficiency, but older ones can go down to about 80. And I have pulled old drip out of old systems. That's definitely just very inefficient. So just understanding that they're never 100%. So taking all of these concepts, all of these questions and all understanding about these parts, coming back to the school garden, how did I think to come up with a system for this? So we had a medium loam, which slightly on the sandier side. So I wanted to go with something with closer drip spaces and pretty short beds. So the beds are only about 10 feet. So I knew my length lines weren't going to be very long. And just kind of looking at that. So we designed a system where we created a simple header. There is a pressure regulator on each little hose bib coming down into that mainline tubing, which is going to be a 1/2 inch there to have enough flow to get into these individual lines that are going down. And this little fava beans on the bottom, you can kind of see how as it's running, the water is going to drip right around that line. And so we're planting the plants right up to that water line, and it's going to be quite dry in the middle, at least when that water is first going through. And I think I'll come back to this. A couple other examples. This is something I installed 2 days ago. It's like a raised bed. So this raised bed doesn't have a hose bib on each thing. So I fed this off of another hose bib, kind of bringing this mainline tubing up, and then also doing a similar thing with our 1/4 inch tubing down each line. And similarly going to be planting right in the center there, and then the plants will kind of grow outward. Another great thing to do, a little tip, is to create circles. Creating circles helps with that pressure that's going through the line, and is going to just tends to work more. So it's really hard to take pictures of irrigation. I'm sorry. But these little herbs here each have their own little circles around them. And that way I know specifically, because I know this is got 4 emitters on each one, that I'm getting about 2 gallons per hour with the thing. So I'm getting about 2 gallons per hour on each of my plants. And so I can figure out my run times knowing what I have on there, and that it's also going to be around that whole root zone. We want to, with a more perennial plant, get the water on all sides of the root zone so that it can thrive and flourish. Similarly, we can do this with a large tree, getting the water all the way around and creating these circles, and they can get really beautiful and elaborate. And then the second photo here, it's kind of hard to see, but in my space, I have these large berms that are about 100 feet long. And so working with 1/4 inch wasn't going to be appropriate for that, because we can only do 15 feet run lines. So putting in 1/2 inch drip line and kind of looping it around and putting the spacing. So it's really assessing what are the needs for your space and how is that going to work. There's really no one size fits all. A great example is I have had to add more water by and more irrigation by watching how things dry down, noticing that often if it's on a slope, maybe some parts are going to be wetter or drier. So getting a good feel for that and adjusting and playing with that. The last little thing I wanted to touch on was, so we understand a little bit more about this wet dry swing, how to install a system, how to create a watering schedule. And like all things, there's no simple answer. So we're coming back to these rules of thumb, watering to the root depths of the plants and adjusting the frequency and quantity for those development stages and those plant needs. And always starting with that 100% field capacity when checking our soil moisture. And I'm pretty sure Delise is also going to send out, I created a little worksheet to help address a little bit more of like how to figure out how much to water, that you can explore on your own once you have some of the answers to these questions about your specific soil, and go from there. And then can email me any questions you have about that, because it does touch on some things that I wasn't able to talk to about here. And then where do we find drip irrigation, if that is a route that you're feeling really good with? Locally in Santa Cruz, we have Ewing, which is a good resource. They're very friendly. They're moderately priced. They're fair. And then down in Watsonville, we have such a wealth of farm supply stores like Pajaro Valley Irrigation, and they do both by the parts, but also by bulk. And I personally, because most of my irrigation experiences have come from farming, do find that I like the quality of farm irrigation versus landscape irrigation. Most are going to function very similarly. They're very slightly different, and I don't think you'd really notice the difference. But if I can go to Watsonville, I really like going down there. But if going in person is not as accessible, there's a lot of online resources. The online resources do tend to be a bit pricier and don't have that same interaction of going in person, and they can help you really make sure you have all those little bits and pieces. And then there's always many garden centers will have small pieces, but they tend to be very pricey and have extreme amounts of packaging. So I tend to stay away from those. Yeah.
Thank you, Avry. This is Delise again. Let me put my camera on. Start video. There I am with my perfectly watered plant. So thank you, Avry, for this information. It's a deep and complicated topic, and I think the really clear takeaway is that how much and how often do you water through any system? It depends. It really depends, and it's really a lot dependent on your soil. So that's important. We want to know how the class was for you, and we are going to be sending in the chat in just a few minutes a link to a survey that's going to take you 5 minutes to fill out. You can do it right away, and then we will get your feedback, and it will include a question about things you would like to see in the future. We're also going to be sending you from the state of California, the State Master Gardener program will send an email asking you if you have used the information that you learned here today. And we really urge you to respond to that also, because that's how the program gets money. And it's really important that we basically validate that we're making an impact by teaching you things that you actually use. Future events that are coming up, we have packed the end of June with some classes. On the 22nd, we're going to be teaching vegetable gardening in containers. That's going to be great for anybody who lives in an apartment, who is a renter, who has just a very small space to work with. So we're going to talk about container gardening. And then we're going to try something new on the 29th. We're going to do Ask a Master Gardener Live. This is people from our hotline who are going to basically respond to questions real time. And anybody who comes to that, please register right away. The information is up on the website now. and you can register and you can pre-submit your questions. And they'll give priority to those who have pre-submitted a question that they can actually research and answer on the camera. So this will be fun, and if it works, we're going to do it every month. And then on the 30th, a wonderful, wonderful class that was presented to just the master gardeners. And we said, boy, the whole world needs to see this. And one of our master gardeners knows about hummingbirds, their life cycle, their natural history, their population changes in this area specifically over time, and then how to develop a garden that will bloom every month of the year so the hummingbirds don't leave the area, that they stay, and you don't have to hang those little red juice feeders that tend to get oh my gosh, the word just flew out of my head. They can make the birds sick if you leave them too long, and there's bacteria in the system. So plants are better, and that's a great class. So I really recommend it. July 17th, we're going to be doing a gray water class. So those of you who have asked some questions about gray water, this will be the one to attend. You will all be on our mailing list unless you choose not to be. So you should be notified about these in a future mailing. And now I'm going to turn it over to Denise, who is going to feed some questions to Avry that we got from you guys in the chat.
All righty, Avry, fortunately you are you did such a great job explaining things. There's only a couple of questions, at least so far. So one is a really basic one, just maybe a quick little description of what loam is. That was just a little bit. I think as things went on, you might have kind of explained that, but just a quick little.
Let me, I think I accidentally stopped sharing my screen. Let's see. There we go. So loam is basically just a term for soil. It's just like a label that has components of sand, silt, and clay. And it tends to, often when we talk about loamy things, I wonder if I can get back into that page of my thing. Oh, let's see. Often when loams tend to be really nice, they're ideal soils that you do want. And if I could, I don't know what happened to my slideshow, but
darn,
it vanished. But so it's just a term for like a soil type, just like any soil type, essentially.
All right. Let's see. And there was one other thing that seemed to be, that was in your presentation, that where you said something about cane fruits run to water. And what do you mean by that?
Yeah, this is, I love this. So cane fruits are like our fruits, like raspberries, blackberries, mostly raspberries and blackberries are the ones that we think of commonly. And the way their roots move, you kind of see this if you have them. They have little runner roots that will like just kind of sprout up, right? Often maybe that one that you planted has died, and then all of a sudden you've got new little ones growing, and they love to just run to the water. So those little roots will go to the water. And I've seen that, I have like a big, beautiful berm of raspberries, and I water that. And then there's a path that I don't water. And then all the raspberries pop up over here in the other berm next to it. So they just, the cane fruits have this magical little way of, they're like, oh, there's no water here, but they'll dig real down in, and then they'll pop up where there is water in other places. So a lot of like Bermuda grass is a good example of something that also does this, has these like rhizomal roots that will just find what they want. And that's kind of what I meant there.
All right. Let's see. So there was a question about determining the root depth
That's a really good question. So with annuals, here really quick. So you can kind of see here, the loam is just a term for these certain soil types. With the root depth, there are rules of thumb for annuals about what the root depths often will be, depending on the plants. And in the handout, I actually does have kind of a simple one where it puts them into what they call shallow, medium, or deep. And kind of good examples are like alliums, like onions and garlic, tend to have really little roots. And you can see this when you pull them out, right? Like they got little itty bitty little roots. And so they're going to be like a crop that doesn't need really deep watering. They always just kind of want more frequent watering. But if you pull out, say, like a tomato, it's going to have big roots. And so it's considered a deeper rooter. And then with the development stages, there's this general rule of thumb that kind of works. And I don't know if I love it, but that a plant's roots will grow a ½ inch a day, which sounds wild, but so you can kind of imagine that every day it's getting a little bit deeper. But they do with annuals kind of cap out, right? Like the little alliums are still only going to have these shallow roots. Even if they're deeper, they're really mostly feeding. So it's not like a 50-day-old plant is going to have 100 inches deep of roots. But there is a little handout with that. And then I guess with perennials, that's where it kind of comes to like getting to know your perennial. Like a fruit tree has that general 18 to 36 inch range, but maybe a more native tree is going to have a much deeper root system. Like elderberries are going to really, or like the elder trees are going to really dig in a little bit deeper because they're more natives. So kind of getting to know that. Did that answer the question?
Okay. It does for me. All right. Okay, just a couple other things. Thoughts on soil moisture meters?
Yeah, that is a good question. I've tried to use one and I can't get it to work right. And I really want to like them, but I have personally never gotten it to work.
All right.
I also,
Okay.
because most of my training came from UCSC and we literally every day just stuck our hands in the dirt. I just love doing that. I just love getting in there and like feeling it. And I'm like, I don't know about this moisture reader. What is this reading? It doesn't know my soil type.
Right. All right. Let's see. I think maybe this was covered, but maybe a thought about differences for the systems between a raised bed and a regular, right in the ground kind of a thing. If there are really specific differences or if it's more on your specific site.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the biggest differences with raised beds, depending on like that one example, that was a pretty extremely raised bed, but the school garden, they're pretty short. It will affect kind of the capacity of where your roots are going outwardly. But they're going down. So I think just thinking a lot of raised beds, I often tend to put the more 1/4 inch smaller tubing on because I know that its size is limited. But once I'm in like the ground, I often naturally want to create longer runs, and so I'll sort of push more towards the bigger tubing. That for me is the biggest difference. And then But I think otherwise, how much water to put down is going to be very similar because raised beds are open on the bottom. So you're still having all of that same interaction with the soil.
All right. And then the last one I have is one that you may or may not have come across. With our drought situation that's going on here, many of our water systems and districts are starting to put restrictions about when you can garden, or excuse me, when you can water and, you know, which days, et cetera. Do you know if that goes specifically or relates specifically to drip systems, or if there's any way to kind of sneak around that?
Yeah, I don't know a ton about that because I am on a well system. And so we're not attached to the water district. So I don't know anything specifically, but there are ways to, when I was farming in Arizona, this was a big thing. You could really only water at certain times. And there are ways, I didn't talk about this much, to really plan ahead with your watering. Because once you understand how the water is, how the soil is going to start drying down and checking the weather, knowing that like, okay, maybe you're allowed to water on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays or something, you can kind of preemptively think that, and maybe your soil moisture is at the like a little higher at the 60%, but you're not going to be able to water for 2 more days. And so you kind of can create these schedules that can work with that, and just like check the weather, I think is a really good way. Like get on it early. I know a lot of the times when these water restrictions have to do with like maybe times of day too. So watering early or later at night, different things like that. But I don't know a ton about what they're doing. From what in Santa Cruz specifically, and I don't know how valid this is. I was having a conversation with somebody and she said that instead of making very strict restrictions, there's just charging people a lot of money. So I don't know if that, to discourage them from using water, which is where also doing this is going to be really awesome. And really like, I'm just like trying to think of all the drought tolerant things and all the things I could dry farm this year. And so that's always a fun thing too, because we have such good dry farmable produce in this region.
All right. And you could always check with your specific water district as well if you have questions about that, I would guess.
Yeah.
All right. And actually, we're going to take one last one that just scooted right in here. Talking about when compost is applied to the soil over time. Do you see changes in the soil's water holding capacity? Perhaps reducing how much, you know, or changing your watering schedules?
Yeah, absolutely. I love compost. So compost essentially is changing your, like, there's like this fourth element of soil, right? The organic matter. And compost kind of works on that organic matter and really does shift that water holding capacity. So yes, compost is awesome, and really soil structure changes so slowly. It's like it's minutely adjustable, but at like just trying to increase that organic material, compost, and also cover cropping, which is another thing that we always come back to, right? Like it's just working on creating good structure. And I like to cover crop where I just chop and drop and just leave that there, and kind of it's almost like composting in place. So all these little things that we can do to kind of just continue to build better soil. Yeah.
Okay. As soon as we say that we're done, we find some more. All right.
This is my favorite part. I like the questions.
Okay. Oh, good. All right. Let's see. So actually early on, someone mentioned that they were interested in any non-plastic options for drip systems. Are there any?
Yeah, I mean, not like, not that I can easily think of. because I personally am like trying to be as zero plastic as possible, and then I work in irrigation and I purchase a lot of plastic. But I think it comes back to this idea of like, what are perennial plastics and what are single-use plastics, and the hope is that these plastics still never go away. They still end up wherever. But if we use them with this intention of, in the long run, saving water and saving resources, and that hopefully they can kind of be a little more neutral. The only things I can think of, systems that might not use plastics, are just from like a time so long ago that they wouldn't be valid now. You know, like you could go all the way back to when they were irrigating things with digging trenches and flooding them, but it's just not how we're functioning. Yeah.
All right. Oh,
Avery,
Elise has a thought.
Can I just mention there's this product called Leaky Pipe, which
Ooh, okay.
is made of it's just sort of an oozing drips. It isn't specific to the plant. You can't put emitters in it, but I believe it's made out of old tires. So it's an upcycled or recycled use of tires, and it's not eliminating the plastic, but it's doing a good thing.
Oh, and that's, yeah, so you're like looking into like recycled. I guess there are also these things, like a little off top, there's those clay spikes.
That would need a lot of those. Yes.
Yeah. Those are I've used them a couple times and they're really cool. But they're not very functional if you have a lot of garden.
Yep. Good for a house plant.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So as far as like maybe on a little bit about troubleshooting, flushing your system periodically, is it something to do on a schedule or just when you're noticing that things aren't working so well, for instance?
Yeah, that's a really good one. Maintenance on especially big systems is similar to like knowing your sedimentation. So I didn't talk about sprinklers, but in this picture that we also have an overhead system, and I have to like walk around and flush those like every other week because I have so much sedimentation. I think it comes down to not necessarily needing a schedule, but just like watching it. And then if you notice an issue, kind of pulling off those end caps, flushing it, or some systems, depending on, you can kind of run a week diluted vinegar through, and that could help break up some of those clogs in the system. But cleaning the filters is gonna be the easiest, and that's why having filters is so important. When I was at UCSC, they're on city water, and I never had to clean the filters. I would check them, and they were never dirty. I clean my filters on my property, and I have 3 before each section. I clean those weekly, so it's similar to kind of your needs.
All right. Let's see, there was a question about the order of putting your irrigation components in when you're setting up your system. I don't know, that might be in the handouts, or maybe you have, let's see, talking about having a Y, a timer, the backflow preventer, pressure regulator, etc.
Yeah, they pretty much go in the order that I put them in here. So like your on-off valve, your filter, then your timer, then your pressure regulator.
You will all get the presentation, so you can refer to that, and you'll also get the video of the recording of this session.
And there's secretly a bonus video that you'll get that I just don't play when I do.
Ooh.
It's actually that system running, but I didn't play it.
And you can go to the irrigation store and they will help you too, correct?
Yeah. And the main thing is really the order only really matters in that you want to filter things before it goes through your timer, because you don't want to clog your timer. And that's why the filter really is what you want to go first.
Okay. All right, a little question on a backflow preventer. That wasn't something that you mentioned before, but I guess if there's city water specifically, you're required to have one. And
Hmm. Yeah, I would imagine most people probably already have one installed in their like underground plumbing. And I wouldn't think you need to add another one onto a hose bib if, like, say you're doing it on a hose bib. But I've never personally had to install anything like that. Yeah.
all right. All right, that's, I believe, and Felice, unless you have,
I think we need to stop this party.
And
it's
really,
been a
like,
good one though.
send me emails because I do respond to them.
Thank you so much for your wisdom, Avery, and thank you, Denise, for doing the questions. And thanks to everybody who spent their, what is it, Thursday evening at dinner time talking about irrigation. And good luck to you. And we look forward to seeing you all on another Master Gardener class soon, probably at the end of June when they're all happening. Thanks so much.